Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today. This is the May installment of the Centre for Environmental Law's webinar series, the Law and Nature Dialogues. I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which Macquarie University is situated, the Wallumattagal clan of the Darug Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. Today, we have the privilege of hosting Professor Jan McDonald from the University of Tasmania. Now, Jan has insisted that biographical information on the material is really to the point. And so I'll just say quickly that I've always been a huge admirer of Professor McDonald's work, going back quite a number of years now, looking at adaptation in the New South Wales and Australian and indeed international comparative context. So I hope everyone gets as much out of this presentation today as I know I will. So without any further delay, I'll pass over to Jan.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's really a pleasure to join you all from Nipaluna Lutrawita, beautiful Hobart, Tasmania, where the Muanina people lived and cared for land and sea country for thousands of years. And in addition to thanking you for that very warm welcome, I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present of the Muanina people and the other First Nations people that cared for country around Australia, wherever you are all located today, and to acknowledge that their sovereignty over this land was never ceded. So I'm going to talk today about some ideas I worked on a couple of years ago with a group of colleagues, some of whom I think will be here today. It's lovely to see some familiar faces and names in the audience, and thank you all for joining. But this group included environmental law colleagues and scholars, David Farrier and Philippa McCormack, some practitioners from the Environmental Defender's Office, a group of ecologists, and some conservation managers. And we were interested in sort of pooling our different perspectives and thinking not so much about the what in terms of the goal of should be the goal of conservation law, but to think about the how do we get there of conservation law reform and what might be the various pathways. And that's really why the focus here is on the adaptation pathways for conservation law and policy rather than the end goal. So the paper and this talk are really intended as provocations. They're sort of, in some ways, deliberately a little bit sort of extreme. So I hope that we can have an interesting conversation at the end about some of the ideas in here. So I want to outline what we talked about in that paper and then reflect a little bit on whether or not it still holds true in light of perhaps some of the recent factors affecting Australia's biodiversity, particularly the Black Summer bushfires, as well as the recommendations of the Samuel Review. You can see there, I'd like to just very briefly, for those who are relative newcomers to Australian conservation law, just provide just a quick upskilling in relation to what our current approaches to conservation law are, and then to talk about these new pathways, the prospect of improving the adaptiveness of current approaches, expanding the current scope or the scope of current approaches, and the hybrid, which is to do both of those things simultaneously, taking a much more integrated approach that both expands our focus and improves adaptiveness. So most of you would know that we have an approach to conservation in Australia that focuses on two broad strategies. One is the set and forget protected area approach, where we identify important areas that are representative of biodiversity across the country. And then we have the species-based approach, which looks at the protection of individual species and to some extent ecosystems and ecological communities. So you can see here that we have both a terrestrial reserve network as well as a marine reserve network. I think it's easy for us to forget the marine space, and it's not always the case that the things that hold true for terrestrial conservation are necessarily directly applicable to the marine estate. But generally speaking, what I want to highlight from these two images is the idea is to try and communicate the importance of these being fixed boundary protected areas. They ostensibly protect a diversity of habitats, but we know that more often than not, they protect areas that are available for protection and are arguably, less valuable for other productive purposes. So just under 20% of Australia's land area is protected under one of the IUCN reserve categories, but that masks some real problems at the sort of detailed level. Only about 42% of bioregions meet the Aichi target of 17% inclusion, and 28% are less than half of that Aichi target of 17%. We also know that our protected areas face a whole range of pressures, not just from climate change, but from encroachment, attempts at delisting or downward listing, invasive species, other competing uses, commercial uses, and so on. We also know that from a climate change perspective, this fixed boundary approach isn't necessarily going to be sufficiently responsive to future changes when species shift. It wasn't based upon the identification of important climate refugia or stepping stones. And we also know that the set and forget approach has very little in the way of active management. And it's becoming increasingly obvious that we will need to do much more active intervention of our natural areas to support their protection and recovery from extreme events. Now, these issues are not unique to Australia. There's been quite a bit of research highlighting the fact that protected areas around the world are threatened by these multiple pressures. If we move then to the current approaches to species conservation, most of you would be familiar with the process of species listing in Australia and the fact that once a species is listed, by rights, it attracts certain levels of protection, and it triggers requirements for evaluation and approval for activities that will further undermine that species. We know that that doesn't work particularly well. Species are generally only listed after they're already in decline. They're very rarely afforded full protection, which I think in many cases is putting it mildly, and I couldn't help but include the black-throated finch as perhaps the poster child for species rarely getting full protection. We don't have any mandatory protections or no-go zones in respect of critical habitat, and nor do we have requirements that future habitat be identified for particular species. Whilst this species approach does trigger some active conservation, we know that in fact implementation of recovery plans is pretty slim, and even used as defensive documents, they don't necessarily work particularly well. So this species-based approach has failed us in the past. Since 1788, we've lost 23 bird species or subspecies, 78 frogs, 28 mammal species. But we currently have more than 1,900 species listed across marine, freshwater and terrestrial environments, not just under the EPBC Act, but more broadly, and over nearly 100 of critically endangered species. And I think it's perhaps a telling signal of how poorly this approach functions that the last week's 2021 threatened species strategy, the only quantitative success story of the 2015 strategy, admittedly not a long time frame, but it talks about having had an improved trajectory for 6 priority birds and 8 priority mammals. And when you look at the numbers on the screen there for how many species are listed, for my money, 14 species having an improved trajectory isn't really a great outcome. So it's not surprising that Graham Samuel concluded, or in fact his opening line in the review was that Australia's natural environment's in an overall state of decline, it's under increasing threat, but importantly, he goes straight to the fact that it's not sufficiently resilient to withstand either current or emerging and future threats, including climate change. So he places climate change very squarely at the centre of the need for reform, because we know that climate change is going to significantly exacerbate the shortcomings of our existing approach. Biodiversity is already responding to climatic changes through distribution, through abundance, behavioural shifts, fundamental changes in community composition as a result of both slow burn changes, but also extreme events. And you know, there are some images on the screen there that remind us of the impacts of cyclone, of heat wave in particular, as well as coastal erosion, which has caused Australia's first climate extinction. So ultimately, what we argue is that conservation law in the future needs to be focused on managing and protecting species, ecosystems, and ecosystem services and landscapes for future change. The change element needs to be central to the approach that we take. And it necessitates 2 key priorities. First, an expansion in the scope of what we try to do and the scope of our objects of protection, as well as building in explicit provision for adaptation and responsiveness. So we need to expand our current approach so that we're not just focusing on set and forget conservation, protected areas and threatened species, but we're taking a broader approach, but also that we are more adaptive in the way in which we manage our objects of conservation. And we talk about the pathways for arriving at that promised land, which of course is a sort of an ongoing goal, and it will forever be a shifting goal. But our focus is recognizing that perhaps the goal is the easy part and the challenge will be to take the first step. And we pondered what might be the possible pathways for achieving this combined set of goals in the future. And we identify 3 possible pathways that consider the possible variable of the focus of conservation law and the possible variable of the need to respond to change in the system. So you can see there on the screen that there's a solid line, which we very imaginatively refer to as Route A, which would see us work with what we currently do and introduce adaptive approaches to current protected area management laws and species-focused laws and management approaches before then taking an expanded scope or moving towards an expanded scope. The alternative as a first step would be to go Route B, which is you stick with the sort of fairly static approaches that we've currently got, but you expand the focus of our conservation efforts so that we take a broader landscape scale approach and then subsequently start building in these adaptive mechanisms. If we were really bold, which I think we probably aren't in Australia at the moment, what we would attempt is at least to try and pilot some areas where we simultaneously reform both the scope of conservation law and its relatively static approach. But in the remaining time, I just want to talk you through some of the ideas and the mechanisms that might be achieved for achieving each one of these three pathways. I think it's fair to say that Route A is probably the easiest starting point because it starts with our existing approach, which is the protected area and species-based approach. And it really contemplates that we augment our existing laws and management practices so that they can better support adaptation and be more responsive to dynamic conditions. So, for example, adaptiveness could be embedded in protected area management strategies or change management arrangements for areas or species when they hit a prescribed threshold. So actually recognizing the need for responsiveness in management plans for protected areas. Making sure that we actually do complete the car reserve estate would also be an important component of this, and building into the priorities for additions to the protected area estate, additional criteria around the prioritization of future climate refugia. And there's been some really tremendous work done in this field by one of the co-authors on this paper, April Reside, who with colleagues at the University of Queensland has mapped climate refugia and stepping stones, at least for Queensland. So working on improving the protected area estate itself so that it is comprehensive, adequate and representative and meets the needs of representative biodiversity into the future would be a useful start. And then managing it in a way that takes account of future needs would also help significantly. We do have some examples of management plans that do at least talk about the importance of adaptiveness and adaptive management approaches, but greater uptake of that kind of language would be a really welcome development there. If we look at the species-based approach, there are a few important reforms that we could consider. At the moment, as I mentioned, we only list species once they're already in trouble, but it's not hard to look at Australia's biodiversity and see areas where there is likely to be further trouble in future. So preemptively listing species or creating a new category of listing as potentially threatened with appropriate criteria for listing would at least start to signal the need for that responsive, future-oriented approach to species management. The second element of improving the adaptiveness of that kind of a listing approach to species conservation would focus on the definitions of critical habitat, so that we aren't just protecting existing critical habitat, but we are protecting and where necessary, restoring areas that will be critical future habitat. We've got some really nice examples of where that's happened in the United States. We also need, as I've mentioned, more willingness and engagement with the possibilities of active management of species, both in situ and in some cases ex situ interventions. And I think in some ways the Black Summer bushfires have opened us up to accepting that necessity more readily and in some cases welcoming it. The Victorian response to the bushfires of last year has very explicitly talked about the need for more active management and more active interventions. And it's not on this slide, but I think we also need to make sure that the defensive tools that we use to protect species, so particularly approvals requirements and environmental impact assessment processes, are also taking future climate impacts into account. And I think that's something that the Samuel Review starts to talk about and does quite a nice job of foreshadowing the need for that broader view of what development approvals and environmental impact assessment processes need to take into account. I'm not suggesting that this is easy, because taking a broader view of critical habitat, adding more species to our lists is necessarily going to involve further constraints on otherwise productive areas of the country. But in a legal sense, it's probably the direction or the pathway that would involve least novelty or least courage on the part of law and policymakers. So if we were taking a yes minister approach, that would probably be the best one to start with. But if we think about the, I'm just trying to move to my next option. The Route B option is to expand the scope of the conservation approaches that we currently have. And I suppose it's at this point we start suggesting some more radical ideas. So it contemplates broadening the focus of conservation frameworks to recognise that we are already facing a whole range of threats. So we need to go beyond protected areas. We need to go beyond threatened species as the basis for conserving biodiversity, to a focus on ecosystems and landscapes. We know that conservation policy pays lip service to this at the moment in Australia, but in practice, I think we are still fairly heavily wedded to the threatened species and protected area-based approaches. One of the questions that would have to be grappled with if we moved to this sort of Route B is whether or not an expanded focus to include landscapes represents an expansion of our conservation effort or a shift in our conservation effort away from existing strategies. If an expanded focus is pursued without additional resources, there will necessarily need to be concomitant reductions in species-focused effort. And so there's questions there about how much reduction in a species-focused effort we would be willing to contemplate or to accommodate or pay for this kind of ecosystem focus. And I think that it would necessarily involve some disagreements about what species we would be willing to let go of and how to balance those trade-offs. Another approach to Route B would see us abandon the species approach altogether in favour of simply protecting representative land systems based on attributes like geology, altitude, rainfall, elevation. This is what some describe as protecting the stage, not the actors. This isn't going to be effective for many species, particularly those that have got very narrow distributions, specific requirements, or those that are already dependent upon intensive intervention. We could also take an approach where we protect virtually everything that's left. We impose much higher restrictions on clearing of any kind of remnant native vegetation, especially the large intact areas, and impose very strict conditions on any future land clearing. Obviously, that's a politically unpalatable option, but it's perhaps the one that would give us the best chances to keep our options open. Rather than have broad-scale restrictions on native veg clearing per se, we could also take a much broader approach to species protection and say that instead of waiting for a species to become threatened before we protect it, we essentially protect all species except those that are excluded. For example, domestic animals and invasive species. And then you would have the protections based on where they are located. I think those two things are sides of the same coin. But obviously, those are going to dramatically increase both the restrictions on future land uses, but also administrative burdens, because both of them contemplate the issuing of permits to allow clearing in some circumstances. It also creates, again, questions about who would make those decisions and under what circumstances. But I think it is an interesting shift that the 2021 Threatened Species Strategy is starting to expand its focus, not just to priority species, but also to priority places. Finally, we've got Route C, which tries to have a bet both ways, that tries to do both of those things simultaneously. We would aim to enhance protection in areas of high future conservation value, identify important buffers and refugia that could be the target of either public or private conservation and funding, as well as making provision for adaptive management. So here what we're thinking is trialling at least some sort of strategic bioregional planning kind of initiatives that would give us a framework for going directly to the kind of conservation law future that we want. Within that kind of planning framework, we would necessarily see trade-offs happen. There is already triage going on in conservation decision-making, but I think that what would be needed as part of that framework is clearer criteria around how we make decisions about what species will be prioritised, what areas will be protected, what areas will become the sacrificial development areas. They're necessarily difficult value judgments. Interestingly, again, the 2021 Threatened Species Strategy offers a starting point for this kind of prioritisation. It articulates 6 principles: risk of extinction, multiple benefits, feasibility and effectiveness, importance to people and uniqueness. So those are the characteristics of species and places that make them good candidates for action. And the 6th principle would be around representativeness, making sure that there's a balance across different taxonomic groups, environments, and parts of Australia. So we see the beginning of some prioritisation criteria there. But I think that it's also interesting to see that this was something that the Samuel Review certainly puts its recommendations behind. It supports this kind of planning at the national level through sort of 2 key mechanisms: the Commonwealth-led regional recovery plans and the idea of these ecologically sustainable development plans. Having said that, in a terrestrial context, the only real experience of these kinds of integrated assessments that we've had in Australia relates to the negotiations that preceded the regional forest agreements. And I am certainly not suggesting that they are an exemplar for the kind of integrated planning that we would need to see. Far from it, in fact. So just to sort of finish off, I think there's a question of where we start. And what I've mapped is a series of pathways that are intended to be, as I said, provocations to you to think about, well, where should we start? If a jurisdiction has started on one path, I think there's no one right or wrong way of moving towards a more climate adaptive conservation law regime. So it's probably good to just start the journey and hope that it covers all of the ground that it needs to. But I would note that Route A can largely be started without fundamental law reform. We already see examples of management strategies that are starting to take a more adaptive approach within the existing mechanisms that we've got. And there are some quite exciting, albeit voluntary approaches to rendering the boundaries of protected areas more permeable not to allow incursions into the existing protected areas, but to open up the possibility for temporally specific and spatially bounded, more temporally bounded, but not so much spatially bounded protected areas that identify seasonal priorities for particular species. We've got some examples relating to the Bittern's in Rice initiative, aiming to sort of protect particular birds during particular times. And there are similar examples in California using the idea of pop-up wetlands. There are real questions about whether or not there is really any appetite at the moment in Australia and indeed elsewhere for any kind of law reform. We're not seeing an awful lot of reaction to the Samuel Review yet. So I'm not holding my breath to see the kind of bold reform that we are suggesting here. And nor are we suggesting that this kind of reform is going to be appropriate or necessary everywhere. If the law doesn't change, I think we need to focus on at least engaging with private landholders and moving public land managers towards more open-minded and interventionist and proactive and adaptive management strategies for the land within their responsibility. And I think that there's also an equal problem. Well, what if we do get law reform along these lines, but resources don't change? And I don't have an easy answer for that, because pretty much all of the things that I've talked about here will involve a significant injection of additional resources. This is the paper that I broadly spoke to today and kind of tried to develop a little bit, but I would be delighted if others read it and gave me feedback on it. But for now, I'd be very happy to take questions and invite conversation from all of you.
Thank you, Jan. Fantastic. Also, of course, the relevance to the Samuel Review and the more recent strategy as well. I think the topicality of this and the updates are going to be hugely helpful to everyone. So yeah, we'll open the floor now to questions. Please, anyone, fire away.
Jan, I might start if I can. I'm Peter Davies from Macquarie. Yeah, really interesting talk, and I guess I've thought a lot about this from a planning perspective. And I guess the question for you is, we know we can't really manage our existing habitats that are protected from development pressure, and we know from a species loss perspective, habitat clearing is the major threatening process. So when we start to think about future adaptive habitats where species only may use those habitats, where does the legal certainty question arise for for the development assessment process? Given we have this ongoing death by 1,000 cuts within areas we know that are critical habitat, let alone the ones that could be in terms of species migration under climate.
Yeah, great question, Peter. I don't have a great answer to it, other than to say that, if we can't do a better job of upholding and enforcing the protections that we already have, then we're in more trouble than under climate change. I suppose what we were foreshadowing using sort of pathway B was a significant ramping up of protections, but recognizing at the same time that we might end up sort of agreeing that there are some sacrificial areas that we will forego conservation values on. I don't necessarily think we've done a particularly good job of that. We've done it by default so far, and I would like to see us be much more mindful and to arrive at that kind of decision based on a clearer process and clearer criteria. But I agree with you that, you know, the current approach is completely unacceptable. You know, the idea that Australia is the only developed country that's, you know, on the WWF list of, you know, deforestation hotspots is completely unacceptable. And I suppose I kind of accepted that as a given at the beginning, that I was focusing on the climate adaptive element, but we need to get the house in order in all of those other respects as well. Not a particularly useful answer, I'm afraid.
Paul, could I jump in and ask a question?
Sure, Dan. Yeah, go ahead, Dan. And then Rebecca, you'll be after Dan.
Thank you. And it's appropriate I follow you, Peter, because, you know, I just follow you around for ecological insights. Jan, fabulous presentation. Thank you, especially from an outsider, a finance background, to get an insight into challenges of existing law and potential future pathways. Please excuse me if it's a little bit out of scope of precisely what you were talking about today, but I can see you are likely to have been thinking into this challenge of lack of appetite for reform. And if you had to put on the hat to do the pitch, especially to motivate public opinion, to support political change, to then implement novel law with a more management orientation, and particularly move away from lists, I can appreciate the extent to which we'll be moving away from, you did place them as the poster child. So of course, the black-throated finches being an example of that stirring up of especially our attitudes to a particular species. And here, especially when you talk about the, dare I say it, sacrificial trade-offs that will occur. I feel like you might be managing an airline and will soon be saying, oh no, is that the right attitude to have? But have you thought into sort of what needs to happen for us to shift and move to something that's a lot more nuanced and sophisticated?
Look, thanks, Dan, for that question. You know, yes, I have, and I can't say, you know, and we talked about that when we were workshopping this paper, and none of us had any particular insights. I suppose there's a couple of things that adaptation practitioners are trying to do in this space, and one is to partner every presentation of a problem with a possible solution. So identifying, not simply identifying problems, but identifying at the very same time the way in which that problem might at least be, we might at least start to overcome that problem. I think in some ways the bushfires last year were a pretty significant turning point for Australia. I think we're seeing far greater openness on the part of the general public to prioritise some of these values, not universally, and I don't think we'll ever get universal recognition of these things, but there's no doubt that there are windows of opportunity around particular extreme events. You know, heat waves and impacts on particular species is another good example of that. But selling the benefits of, you know, efficiencies in some of these approaches, I think has also some potential for political traction, because the species-based approach, for example, is hugely expensive, and it's more expensive when you consider how little it achieves. You know, even the process of listing, you know, once you've gone through the listing process, there's no money left for anything else. So so I suppose taking a solutions-oriented approach when you're identifying problems, working with affected industries as much as possible has been another particularly effective strategy, perhaps more in the marine space, but I think there's opportunities there with agriculture in particular. And I don't really have a solution in relation to land use pressures in relation to mining and urban development at the moment, other than just to despair.
That's very solid. Thank you for that, Jan.
Jan, thanks so much for your presentation, and hello, everyone. I just wanted to bring to your attention a report that came out a couple of months ago, because you mentioned the Fish and Wildlife Service before. This report, it's called the RAD framework, Resist, Accept, Direct framework for conservation managers in the United States. And they appear to be identifying maybe a route D, which is a little bit different from the ones that you've identified, that accepts that it's a legitimate option to try to directly affect the trajectory of change by deliberately altering species compositions and ecosystem compositions to adapt them to climate change, as well as to just accept the trajectory of change and accept loss versus resist the trajectory of change. And I'm wondering, those things sound more controversial in an Australian context, I think, but I raised the report because this isn't theorising. They've actually asked conservation managers of public lands, what are you actually doing on the ground right now, and identified those three management options. And I just wonder whether you have any reflections on that from an Australian context.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I hadn't heard about the RAD report or the RAD framework, but that would probably fit into our route A, Beck. It's so when I talk about more active management, that includes the whole spectrum, right up to quite significant manipulation of translocation of species, assisted colonization, and I've acknowledge the unpalatability of that expression. I don't know whether Philippa is on the line, but that's a piece of work that Philippa has done, has looked at in a bit more detail. But I wouldn't describe that as a path D. It's definitely contemplated as part of our A. That if we're going to stick with a species approach, we need to think about what kind of interventions are needed to manage that more effectively. And some of it will be quite interventionist, both in situ and ex situ.
And do you think that that's, given that there's evidence that that's actually happening, on the public lands front in the US, does that give you any scope for hope that it might be more palatable in Australia?
I think we're already doing it, not necessarily in a climate responsive way, but so I can give you examples. Here in Tasmania, there's Dipipwi goes out to an island that's an albatross colony off the northwest coast, and it does an annual an application of a lice pesticide to the albatross chicks to increase their survival rates. And it's now started to put in place artificial nests that will, because the birds that are on the margins have got the worst quality nest. And so they're working on simply trying to build up the overall resilience of the species. We've got a few examples of translocation, and the Great Barrier Reef interventions are perhaps the most advanced in that way. Talking about the possibility of seeding the southern reef with specimens from north adapted specimens of the same species that are more warm adapted. So I think we're already doing it in Australia. The problem is all of that costs quite a lot of money. And so I'm not sure that we're going to be able to rely wholly on that kind of quite deliberate management intervention. Ellie?
Hi, Jan.
Hi, Ellie.
Thank you for the really interesting presentation. It was great. Just one comment on the sort of last point you made. I think also a lot of those interventionist programs, we also have to be careful with, not only are they often very, very expensive, but they often have less potential of actually saving species than actually saving species in their original locations. So I think we just have to be very careful when we're thinking about those sort of highly interventionist projects as perhaps being a silver bullet for saving species. So
I absolutely agree. And there is obviously the significant risk that in saving one, you jeopardize others, and or at least jeopardize the integrity of other systems. You know, I have to say the Govind intervention policy is actually a really nice example of how you might put in place a risk assessment framework and a prioritization framework for how you decide on the appropriateness of these strategies, from an R&D up to an upscaling and deployment level. But I completely agree with you that you know, the benefits to one species might be more than outweighed by impacts on, you know, the receiving environment.
But to my question, you mentioned the Aichi targets and how we're not doing overly well at meeting those. But I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on the post-2020 biodiversity agenda, which is hopefully to be agreed this year, and whether you feel that there will be any flow-on effect from that sort of new agreement if it does actually eventuate.
At this stage, no, I don't. And in large part because it's not a negotiation process that I've been keeping up to date with, Ellie. I have to be really honest there.
Yeah. No, I mean, I find it really interesting because I think they've, particularly around the ocean areas, I think they've watered down a lot of that language. So I was just wondering if we are sort of seeing, you know, some flow-on effects because of those conversations. But
yeah, I mean, the BBNJ negotiations leave me pretty cold. So yeah, I'm not. I should never say this in a group like this, but you know, I tend to focus on what national governments can do. I know that the Australian government is directed by its obligations, you know, or chooses to constrain itself by its international obligations, but domestic regulation to me is still, you know, what can happen the fastest. You know, and even sort of local, you know, management plan level interventions are the things that are capable of delivering the most immediate change. So I haven't focused as much on the international law framework.
thanks.
But I love the work of those of you who do.
Okay, Hannah, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Jan. That was a
Hi,
fabulous presentation. Hi. My question is about the active interventions that you've been advocating in Route A and this fraught issue of forest policy. It's Reconciliation Week, speaking from Ngunnawal country in Canberra. The Black Summer bushfires affected us terribly, and it's the second in 20 years. We had them in 2003. This week, Bruce Pascoe has been advocating the thinning of forests to 10 trees per acre. And I don't know why he used acre rather than hectare, but he says that it's really the only way to prevent wildfires as the climate dries under climate change, and that is how that was the forest density that used to prevail under Indigenous management strategies. Now that would be very unpalatable to many people and could have a catastrophic impact on forest biodiversity. So I just wonder if you'd like to comment on that kind of very radical approach, but also thinking about the urban areas where we do have forests right through cities, you know, that are quite dense and vulnerable to fire.
Just so I'm clear, Hannah, what would you?
So my
like
question
to
is, your active intervention. So your route A.
Yeah.
So think forested areas.
Yes. Okay. So I think that when we were talking about active interventions, we were focusing more on active management of species. And I suppose in some cases, active management of protected areas. I'm obviously not in a position to comment on, Bruce's recommendations, and I'm sure that there would be others who would take a different view. There is a very wide range of, I can see Lee nodding emphatically there. There's a huge amount of research that suggests that the last thing you should be doing is logging burnt forest. And there's an equally strong view that that the unburnt stuff is so important that we can't afford to actually do anything to it at the moment, at least until there is some level of recovery. My own bias is that I'm very sympathetic to that view. I think that there is no doubt that we are going to see regime shift in a number of our native forests around the country, because yes, this one was unprecedented, but we know that there will be more, that they won't be unprecedented from now on. We've seen that, if you look at the Victorian bushfires report, the number of areas or the parts of that protected area or estate that have now been burnt 3, 4, and 5 times in the last 20 years. I'm not sure that it's useful to talk about much more intervention in those landscapes, I think. But I say that without any science expertise. That's me sort of speaking perhaps more emotionally about the short-term impacts of some of those things. And in desperation at things like the federal court's decision on the Friends of Leadbeater's possum case, for example. Yeah.
Okay, I think thanks.
Thank you, Hannah. Professor Godden, would you like to ask your question?
Lee is fine.
Okay,
hi, Jan. Thanks very much. And I think it's really great to have this presentation and really to be raising the issue as you and your group of researchers have done, because I think biodiversity has fallen off the attention span of many of us, and so just wonderful to see this and so many people here. I have a couple of quick comments, and yes, going back to Hannah's point, I think there will be a great deal of diversity in the opinions that are offered around how best to address issues of Indigenous management. But I think there is a broader point that our national reserve system is actually augmented quite considerably by about 40% by Indigenous protected areas across Australia. So we really need to be thinking partnerships very closely here with Indigenous peoples. So I think that's one of the things that Gabrumpa also takes a really strong initiative in that area. So I guess that's my comment there. The other, more of a question is, and it goes back to the query by Dan. To what extent, if we're thinking about radically shifting our approaches to conservation, I'm wondering if we start to break down the rural and the urban dichotomy in conservation, and really start to actually think of refugia for climate and so on in a much more active way in our urban space. And to think about, for example, and it's highly controversial, the offsets policy on development, but whether in fact you could start using your offsets policy in conjunction with a climate refugia when we're thinking about development approvals processes, because being a cynic, I don't see any great movement going to be happening federally in respect of that. But I think that industry itself might be persuaded through either a form of litigation or some social responsibility to start thinking in a more active way about its involvement in climate change adaptation. And I think that I'm just throwing that out there as a thought.
So great observations, Lee, and I agree with you. Interestingly, the Samuel Review actually makes some really nice recommendations around this, and essentially sort of says, you know, we really should be, we should be at the point now where we don't have any averted loss offset allowances in Australia, and everything should be focused on restoration offsets. And I think that that's really what you're talking about, the importance of identifying refugia, identifying future climate habitat, and then ensuring that what is going to be climatically appropriate is also appropriate in terms of its current land use and you know, patterns of vegetation and so on. And the other interesting thing that he talks about in terms of incentives is, perhaps it's not as explicit as this, but I think that he identifies a problem with the fact that you've got to choose between having carbon offsets or biodiversity offsets, and that there might be, in our quest for better alignment and better incentivizing of restoration and protection activities on private land, that we need to be focusing on future offsets, you know, establishing them now, you know, doing the old biobanking thing, I think, in some respects, but then enabling people to do a little bit of double dipping and actually getting the dual benefits of carbon offsets as well as biodiversity credits in the future. I haven't, that's my understanding from having read it just a couple of times, and I haven't sort of digested it much more than that, but I think that there is some stuff there that might actually be quite appealing to the governments that we have in place at the moment.
Yeah, look, that's my thinking, and it comes out a lot of the work that was done on the UN RED Plus projects that a group of us at Melbourne did. So it was sort of, can you actually translate that into the Australian domestic space, particularly to get what was seen as the co-benefits both of, and also, I mean, it is also a thing that we might be able to think about Indigenous governance there as well. So it can meet a couple of those objectives. But yeah, I don't want to monopolise. But just to put on another comment, the Victorian government, the Legislative Council, there's an inquiry into ecosystem decline there, and it's got a very strong restoration focus. So if people are interested in having a look at that parliamentary process, it's online.
Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Lee. Well, that takes us very much to the end of the webinar. We're almost at 2 o'clock. I would just like to say thank you again to Jan, Professor McDonald, for the fascinating talk and insight into, well, into just about everything really that was covered, not just in the presentation really, but also in the responses to the questions. And thank you to all of those people who did ask questions. I think, yeah, that really did enhance everything that we're trying to do with this particular installment of the webinar and what we're trying to do at the Centre for Environmental Law as well. So yeah, thank you for the little applause icons up there. Thank you. If everyone could join me now, please, in thanking Jan for a wonderful presentation today. We will, yeah, probably call it a day there. For those of you as well interested, we had a live Twitter feed running. Thank you to those members of the Cell volunteer team who have been keeping that up and running. So that will give you, yeah, just a sort of a brief overview of what Jan was talking about, and hopefully as well an overview of the questions. Okay, so Janice, anything else you'd like to add before?
No, only thank you to you, Paul, and to the rest of the Cell team for the invitation today and the opportunity to talk to you all. Thanks everybody for joining us. I really enjoyed that conversation at the end. Lovely to see so many familiar faces that I haven't seen for quite a while.
Oh, excellent, excellent. It's good we could bring so many people together.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Please note we have another Cell Law and Nature Dialogue in June, and information will be sent out about that through our Twitter feed and various sort of email channels as well. But yeah, again, just to wrap up, thank you again, Jan. Wonderful presentation, and yeah, hope to see everybody soon.
Great. Thanks, Paul.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you. Bye-bye.